Elena Vance had mastered the art of being invisible. It wasn't a skill she'd been born with. It was one she'd sharpened over years of practice, honed like a blade until it could cut through any room, any crowd, any social situation that threatened to expose her. She sat in the third row of every lecture hall, never the front, too visible, never the back, too rebellious. Third row was perfect. Third row said, "I'm here. I'm serious. Don't look at me." Her dark hair was always pulled back in a tight ponytail that pulled at her temples, just enough to keep her focused. Her hoodie, always gray, always oversized, swallowed her frame, sleeves pulled over her hands like armor. When she took notes, her pen moved at lightning speed, filling margins with precise, elegant script that her professors had long since stopped trying to decipher. Top of her class, STEM scholarship, never late, never loud, never invited to parties, and never defended when someone decided she was an easy target. Elena had learned early that keeping her head down was easier than fighting back. College bullies didn't shove you into lockers like in the movies. They smiled too wide, laughed too loud, and made sure you always felt just a little smaller than everyone else. Especially Vivian Cross. Vivian was everything Elena wasn't. Confident, sharp-tongued, effortlessly cool in that way that made people want to be near her like she was the sun and everyone else were planets orbiting in her gravity. She walked through campus like it belonged to her, designer boots clicking against pavement, perfect eyeliner never smudged, a reputation for parties and hookups, and getting away with anything. And for some reason Elena had never figured out, some cosmic joke the universe was playing at her expense. Vivian had decided Elena was fun to mess with. "Nice hoodie," Vivian drawled one afternoon, leaning against Elena's desk with the casual arrogance of someone who'd never been told no. Her eyes flicked over Elena like she was a curiosity, something mildly entertaining in a boring exhibit. "Do you own anything that isn't gray?" Elena didn't look up. She never did. Silence was safer than whatever Vivian wanted from her. Vivian smirked anyway, satisfied, before drifting back to her friends. Another small victory in her world of status and spectacle. That was college. But college wasn't the only place Elena existed. Under stadium lights, Elena Vance didn't disappear. She commanded. The moment she stepped onto the football pitch in her black and gold kit, something fundamental shifted in her posture. Shoulders squared, jaw set, eyes sharp with a focus that cut through everything else, the crowd, the pressure, the weight of expectations. The captain's band around her arm wasn't just fabric. It was permission to be someone else entirely. This was her territory. And across from her, adjusting her own captain's band with lazy confidence, stood Vivian Cross, captain of Southridge FC, star striker, crowd favorite. Vivian spotted Elena immediately and laughed, actually laughed, like this were some private joke, only she understood. "Well, I'll be," Vivian called across midfield. Didn't know library girls were allowed out past sunset. Elena didn't smile. She stepped into position, eyes cold, her scent, something clean and sharp like rain on concrete, flaring just slightly with irritation. She'd learned to control it, to keep it contained, but Vivian had a way of making her forget control existed. "Try to keep up," Elena said flatly. The whistle blew. From the first clash, it was war. Elena went in hard, clean but unforgiving, stealing the ball straight off Vivian's foot. She didn't even look back as Vivian stumbled, just kept moving, her voice low and cutting as she sprinted past. "Careful! Wouldn't want you to break a nail." Vivian snarled and chased her down, shoulder-checking her seconds later, sending Elena skidding across the turf. The impact rattled through her bones, but she was already scrambling up, already ready. Thought you were smarter than that, Vance. Vivian shot back, her scent sharpening with aggression, something warm and spicy that Elena refused to acknowledge. Or, do you only think when you've got a textbook? The match turned brutal. Every tackle between them was deliberate. Every pass intercepted felt personal. Elena marked Vivian relentlessly, cutting off her angles, forcing her to overextend, then punishing her for it. When Elena slipped past Southridge's defense and scored, she didn't celebrate. She just glanced at Vivian and said coolly, "Too slow." Vivian answered by scoring minutes later, ripping the ball past the keeper and spinning back toward Elena with a sharp grin that was all teeth. Guess studying didn't help you there. By halftime, they were shouting at each other between breaths, sweat-soaked and furious, neither willing to give an inch. The air between them crackled with something that wasn't quite hatred, something more complicated, more dangerous. By the final whistle, the match ended in a tie, but it felt like a loss for both of them. As they passed each other leaving the field, Vivian leaned in, voice low and biting. "Enjoy your little fantasy out here," she said. "Tomorrow, you're still just the quiet girl everyone walks over." Elena stopped, turned, met Vivian's glare without flinching. "Enjoy your popularity," Elena replied. "Out here, you're nothing special." They walked away in opposite directions, anger crackling in the air between them. No respect, no admiration, just rivalry sharp enough to draw blood, and dangerously impossible to ignore. Elena was halfway to the professor's desk when it happened. A shoulder slammed into hers, hard enough to knock the breath from her lungs. Her folder slipped from her arms, papers scattering across the lecture hall floor like fallen feathers. A familiar laugh followed. "Watch it," Vivian Cross said casually, not even slowing as she pushed past. "Some of us have places to be." Elena crouched instantly, cheeks burning as whispers rippled through the room. She gathered her work with shaking hands, jaw tight, and when she finally looked up, Vivian was already in her seat, legs stretched out, smirk firmly in place. Their eyes met. They scowled at each other in perfect, mutual disdain. "Careful," Vivian called lazily as Elena passed her row. "Wouldn't want you dropping your precious notes again." Elena said nothing, but her fingers curled tighter around her papers. Professor Hale arrived moments later, clapping her hands once for attention. "All right, everyone, for your midterm project, you'll be working in pairs." A collective groan filled the room. Professor Hale began reading names. Elena Vance, Vivian Cross. The room went dead quiet. Elena Froze. Vivian let out a sharp, disbelieving laugh. "You've got to be kidding." For the first time all semester, maybe all year, Elena stood. Gasps followed. "Professor," Elena said, voice steady despite the knot in her chest. "I'd like a different partner." Every eye in the room was on her now. "I'm serious," she added quickly. "I need someone who won't." She stopped herself, regrouped. "Someone who actually takes this class seriously." Vivian scoffed. "Oh, please. Like I'd want to work with her. Pair me with literally anyone else." Professor Hale raised an eyebrow. "Interesting. It's rare for both students to agree." Hope flared, brief and fragile, then died. "No," the professor said flatly. "You'll work together. Learning to collaborate with people you dislike is part of the assignment." Elena's hands clenched at her sides. Vivian rolled her eyes and slouched back in her chair, muttering something that sounded like fantastic. They didn't look at each other again. After class, the lecture hall emptied fast. Elena waited. Vivian was halfway out the door when Elena finally spoke. Cross. Vivian stopped, slowly turned. What, Vance? Finally figured out how to use your words. Elena stepped closer. Close enough that Vivian had to actually look at her. Really look, not the quiet background girl, but someone sharp-eyed and unflinching. We're meeting in the library after school, Elena said. No hesitation. No ipalizi. You're doing your part. I'm not picking up your slack. Vivian blinked once, then laughed, low, amused. Wow, she said. Didn't know you had it in you. Elena held her ground. Be there or don't. But if you fail, it's on you. She turned and walked away before Vivian could respond. Vivian watched her go, irritation buzzing under her skin, along with something far more unsettling. Because for just a split second, that wasn't the quiet nerd she dismissed all year. And she didn't know how she felt about that. The library was quiet enough to make every sound feel loud. Elena was already seated when Vivian arrived. Of course she was. Books stacked neatly, laptop open, notes arranged with infuriating precision. She didn't look up when Vivian dropped into the chair across from her. You're late, Elena said. Vivian snorted. 5 minutes. Try not to faint. Elena's fingers paused over the keyboard. Slowly, she lifted her gaze. The look she gave Vivian was the same one she used on the pitch. Cold, assessing, merciless. Sit down or leave, Elena said. I don't have time for posturing. Vivian leaned back instead, deliberately relaxed. Funny, you never seem to run out of energy when we're playing. Elena slid a printed outline across the table. This is the project structure. You'll handle the case analysis. Vivian glanced at it. Already decided that, Captain? Elena's jaw tightened. Don't call me that. Vivian's lips curved. Why? You earn it every time you shut me down at midfield. Elena leaned forward slightly. If you put half as much effort into your studies as you do trying to get under my skin, you wouldn't be failing. That landed hard. Vivian straightened, eyes flashing. You think I don't try? I think you try when it matters to you, Elena replied evenly. You're disciplined, aggressive, focused. You just pretend this, she gestured to the books, is beneath you. Their knees brushed under the table. Neither of them moved away. Vivian laughed quietly, but there was no humor in it. You always this condescending? Or is that just for your rivals? Elena didn't break eye contact. You wouldn't last a week on my team with your attitude. Vivian leaned in, close enough that Elena could feel her breath, could catch the warm, spiced undertone of her scent beneath the library's antiseptic neutrality. Funny, Vivian murmured. You don't seem to mind me that much when we're shoulder to shoulder. Elena's breath caught, just slightly. Her omega instincts, the ones she'd spent years learning to suppress, hummed with unwanted awareness. Vivian was alpha, not just any alpha, but the kind that commanded attention, demanded reaction, the kind Elena had sworn she'd never let get close. Focus, she said sharper now. We're not on the pitch. Could have fooled me. Vivian's voice dropped lower. You've got that same look, like you're daring me to mess up. Maybe I am. Their faces were far too close now. Heat bled into the space between them. Unwelcome, undeniable. Vivian's gaze flicked briefly to Elena's mouth, then back to her eyes. Elena noticed. She pushed her chair back abruptly. Be here. Do the work. Don't make me regret this. Vivian watched her stand, irritation curling into something darker, more confusing. You know, Vivian said lightly, for someone who claims to hate me, You pay a lot of attention. Elena paused, didn't turn around. Don't mistake awareness for interest, she said. But Vivian smiled anyway, because Elena Vance didn't deny it. Vivian Cross had a problem. She noticed it when she reread the same paragraph 3 times and still couldn't remember a word of it. When she showed up early to class, early and didn't know why. When she found herself glancing toward the door, irritated when Elena wasn't there yet, and even more irritated when she was. It was stupid. Elena Vance was annoying, sharp-tongued, judging, too serious, too quiet. So why did Vivian keep thinking about the way Elena had looked up at her in the library, unflinching, unimpressed, like she wasn't dazzled by Vivian's reputation at all? Why did she hear Elena's voice in her head? You're capable. The thought made Vivian scowl at her notes and slam the notebook shut. Get a grip, she muttered. This was just rivalry, ego, being challenged for once. It definitely wasn't the way her chest tightened whenever she remembered how close they'd been under that table. Definitely not. The next match came too quickly. It was brutal from the first whistle. Northside versus Southridge always was, but tonight it was personal in a way neither team fully understood. Elena and Vivian circled each other like predators. You gonna keep hiding behind your midfield? Vivian taunted as she closed in. Or are you scared to lose again, Captain? Elena stole the ball cleanly, shoulder brushing Vivian's as she passed. Focus on your footing, she said coolly. You're sloppy when you're emotional. Vivian growled and chased her down, forcing her toward the sideline. You think you're better than me? I know, I'm more disciplined. Elena shot back. They collided near midfield. Hard. Hands tangled, cleats scraped, their bodies pressed together, far closer than necessary, both fighting for control of the ball. Too close. Vivian inhaled sharply, caught the faint scent of rain and clean soap, and something distinctly Elena, something underneath, something Omega. Elena's breath hitched in return, warm against Vivian's cheek. Her scent spiked with something she couldn't control, something that made Vivian's alpha instincts sit up and pay attention. The world narrowed. Get off me, Vivian snapped, but she didn't move away. You're the one pushing. Elena hissed back. They shoved at the same time. Lost balance. Hit the ground. The ball rolled forgotten as they fell, Vivian landing half on top of Elena, hands braced on either side of her shoulders. For half a second, neither of them breathed. Their lips met. It wasn't soft. It wasn't planned. It was heat and shock, and too much at once. They froze, eyes wide, minds blank. Then they ripped apart, like they'd been burned. What the hell? Vivian started. Elena was already scrambling up, face flushed, eyes wild. I can't, she muttered, then turned and ran. The whistle blew. Shouts erupted. Substitutes were called in as Elena disappeared down the tunnel. Vivian didn't even hesitate. She followed. Vivian found her near the concrete corridor behind the stands. Elena had her hands braced against the wall, breathing hard, hair coming loose from its tie. Running now. Vivian snapped. That's new. Elena spun around so fast she nearly lost her footing. You shouldn't have followed me. The tunnel lights hummed overhead. The distant echo of lockers slamming somewhere far off made the space feel hollow. Private. Too private. Vivian stopped a few feet away, chest rising hard from the run. Then why did you run? She shot back. Elena's jaw tightened. I didn't. You did. Vivian stepped closer, not enough to touch, just enough to crowd the air between them. The second we She cut herself off, breath catching. You looked at me like I'd done something to you. Silence cracked between them. Elena swallowed. The memory flashed too clearly. The collision, the stumble, the way their mouths had brushed for a lingering breath. Too long. Accidental heat and friction and adrenaline. That didn't mean anything, Elena said sharply. Too fast. Vivian's eyes dropped. Not to her lips, but close enough that it felt deliberate. Then why are you shaking? Elena hadn't realized she was. Her hands curled into fists at her sides. I'm not. You are. Vivian's voice lowered, rougher now, less accusation, more something else. And you ran like it scared you. It didn't scare me. Then what did it do? The question hung there, heavy, waiting. That did it. Vivian closed the distance in 2 strides, grabbing a fistful of Elena's hoodie and shoving her back against the wall. Not gentle, not careful. The impact knocked the breath from Elena's lungs. You don't get to act like that was nothing and then bolt like I imagined it, Vivian growled, her grip tightening in the fabric. Elena shoved back, palms flat against Vivian's chest, feeling the rapid thud beneath her hands. You think you're the only one confused, she snapped. Vivian's fingers flexed. Confused wasn't the right word. Neither was angry. Elena could feel it again. That same pull, the same unbearable awareness. Vivian's alpha scent, warm and spiced and overwhelming, was doing something to her omega instincts that she couldn't control. I hate you, Vivian said. Good. Elena snapped. Because I don't know what I'd do if I didn't. The words settled between them like a live wire. Neither of them moved. The tunnel felt smaller somehow, quieter, the air thick with breath and adrenaline, and something neither of them wanted to name. Vivian's hand was still fisted in Elena's jersey. Elena's fingers were still twisted in Vivian's. Neither let go. Their chests rose and fell in uneven rhythm, almost sinking, almost not. Vivian's eyes flicked down, just for a second, to Elena's mouth. Then back up. A challenge. A warning. Elena didn't step away. Didn't look away. You're impossible, Vivian muttered, but her voice lacked conviction now. It sounded strained, fractured. Then leave. Elena shot back. But she didn't push her away. Another breath. Another inch closer. The tension didn't feel heavy anymore. It felt volatile. The air between them tightened until it was impossible to breathe. And Vivian's restraint finally gave out. Vivian kissed her, hard, furious, all teeth and heat and frustration. Elena gasped, then grabbed Vivian's jersey, yanking her closer, kissing her back just as aggressively. It wasn't tender. It was everything they'd been holding back. They broke apart breathless, foreheads nearly touching. Neither of them spoke. Neither of them looked away. And for the first time, hate didn't feel like the right word anymore. The locker rooms were louder than usual, not from celebration, from lectures. You're there, Captain, Coach Ramirez said for what felt like the 5th time, arms crossed tight across his chest. Captains don't disappear mid-match. Elena stood rigid in front of him, hands clasped behind her back, like she could hold herself together through posture alone. Mud still streaked her socks. Her pulse still hadn't settled. Across the hall, muffled through concrete walls, another voice rose, sharper, angrier. Vivian's manager, same conversation, different tone. You left your team exposed. Do you understand that? Elena swallowed. Yes, coach. You're lucky the defense held. Lucky. The word landed heavy. She nodded again, throat tight. It won't happen again. Coach studied her for a long moment before sighing. Disappointment was softer now, but somehow worse. I know how seriously you take this, Vance. That's why this is surprising. That was the problem. She did take it seriously. Always. Until tonight. Until a collision turned into breath against breath, hands gripping jerseys, the world shrinking to hazel eyes and heat, and something reckless she hadn't stopped. Something she hadn't wanted to stop. Go shower, he said finally. Clear your head. Elena nodded quickly and turned before he could see, the way her composure cracked. The corridor outside the locker rooms was nearly empty now, echoes fading as teams filtered out. She leaned briefly against the cool wall, closing her eyes. Her chest still felt tight, not from running, from memory. The tunnel, Vivian's hand at her waist. The shock of it, the kiss, sudden and desperate, and wrong in every way that made it impossible to forget. Elena dragged a hand down her face. Reckless. That's what it had been. She couldn't afford reckless. Not here, not now. Football wasn't just a game to her. It was structure, stability, proof she deserved to be here at all. Every practice, every grade, every match stacked carefully, like something that could collapse if she slipped even once. And tonight she'd slipped because of Vivian Cross, because she'd kissed her back. Footsteps echoed down the hall. Elena straightened instantly. Vivian rounded the corner, hair still damp from a rushed shower, jacket slung over one shoulder. She slowed the second she saw Elena. For a moment, neither spoke. The air shifted, charged, fragile. Vivian's usual smirk didn't quite form. Guess we both survived the execution. Elena looked away first. We shouldn't have left the field. A beat. That's what you're worried about? Vivian asked quietly. Elena's jaw tightened. It matters. Something flickered across Vivian's face. Annoyance, maybe hurt, before she masked it with a shrug. Relax, Vance. One bad decision isn't the end of the world. For you, maybe. Elena didn't say it aloud. Instead, she pushed off the wall. It won't happen again. The words came out too fast, too firm. Vivian stilled. Right, she said after a second, voice lighter than her eyes. Good to know. Silence stretched between them, thick with everything neither of them named. Elena stepped past her. The moment their shoulders brushed, heat sparked again, unwanted, undeniable. She kept walking, didn't look back. Behind her, Vivian stood motionless in the hallway long after she'd gone, staring at the space Elena left behind. They didn't talk about it. Not the kiss. Not the wall. Not the way neither of them slept that night. At college, Elena avoided Vivian with surgical precision, changing seats last minute, packing up early, slipping out between conversations. She stopped going to the library at their usual time. Vivian noticed. Of course she did. It irritated her more than she liked to admit. Elena Vance, who never ran from anything, was suddenly gone like smoke. And Vivian hated that she was the one chasing ghosts now. She caught herself staring at the empty chair across the lecture hall. Doesn't matter, she told herself. It was a mistake. A stupid, adrenaline-fueled mistake. So why did it feel unfinished? As the avoidance continued, so did Vivian's irritation. When Elena stopped looking her way, Vivian made sure to sit where she couldn't be ignored. When Elena packed up early, Vivian lingered, stretching conversations, asking pointless questions, finding excuses to stay in her orbit just a little longer. The project they'd already been assigned together became her easiest excuse. But even that wasn't enough. Every time Vivian brought it up, the response was the same. Elena hadn't even looked up properly. We'll split the work. Send me your part when it's done. Short, efficient, distant, no teasing, no bite, no spark, just space. The irritation kept growing under Vivian's skin. She told herself it was about control, about not letting Vance think she could just disappear on her. But every clipped reply tightened something in her chest. She could feel Elena slipping just out of reach, and she hated it more than she thought she hated Elena. Because hatred had been simple, predictable. This quiet avoidance, this polite detachment, it unsettled her. And if this was really just about control, she wouldn't have started trying in class. The first time Vivian raised her hand in class, people laughed. The second time, they stopped. By the third week, even Professor Hale looked surprised. Vivian's notes were actually taken, her arguments sharp and structured, the way she no longer skipped readings. You trying to impress someone? One of Vivian's friends joked. Vivian shrugged, trying not to fail. But her gaze flickered, almost involuntarily, toward Elena. Still distant, still careful, still pretending nothing had changed in the tunnel. When Vivian slid into her seat beside Elena one morning, uninvited, Elena stiffened. "You're in my space," Elena said quietly. Vivian leaned closer. "Anyway, relax. I thought you liked being challenged." Elena shot her a look. "You're doing this on purpose." Vivian smiled. "Maybe." And that scared Elena more than the bullying ever had. Vivian tilted her head, studying her reaction like it amused her. "What?" she said lightly. "You miss the old version of me?" Before Elena could respond, Vivian reached out and snatched her glasses right off her face. "Hey!" Elena's hand shot out instinctively. Vivian stood, lifting the glasses just out of reach, arm extended lazily above her head. "Careful," she teased. "You're gonna knock something over." Elena scowled, stepping closer, fingers brushing Vivian's wrist as she tried to grab them back. "Give them back." "Or what?" She reached again. Too close. Elena could smell her, clean sweat, something sharp and familiar. Her heart started pounding, not from anger, from the sudden awareness of how little space there was between them. "Why are you doing this?" Elena asked quietly. The question wasn't sharp this time. It was honest. Vivian froze for just a moment. The teasing slipped. "Who knows?" Vivian said after a beat, voice lower now. "Maybe I want your attention." Elena swallowed. "Or maybe," Vivian continued, eyes locked on hers, "I'm tired of you pretending I don't exist." The words landed heavier than any insult ever had. Vivian stepped back just enough to break the spell, dangling the glasses between her fingers. Her smirk returned, but it didn't quite reach her eyes. "If you want these back," she said casually, "meet me at the library. Usual time." She closed her fingers around the glasses instead of handing them over, already stepping back. Elena's hand hovered uselessly in the air. Vivian paused at the aisle, glancing over her shoulder with a crooked smile. "Try not to avoid me this time." Then she walked away, with Elena's glasses still in her hand. Elena didn't move for a long time after Vivian left. The room felt wrong without her glasses. Edges blurred, faces indistinct, the world suddenly too loud and too close. She pressed her palms flat against the desk, breathing through the tightness in her chest. "She can't do this. I won't let her." She could report it, tell the professor, demand her property back. The thought tasted hollow, because that would mean admitting how easily Vivian had gotten under her skin. All afternoon, Elena tried to focus. She copied notes she couldn't properly see, read sentences twice, 3 times without absorbing them. Every time the door opened, her heart jumped. Stupid, traitorous thing that it was. Usual time. Vivian had said it like it was a given, like Elena would show up, like she already knew the answer. Elena hated that part most of all. By the time the last lecture ended, her head was pounding. She stood in the hallway, bag clutched tight, staring down the corridor that led away from the library. She turned the other way, took 3 steps, stopped. Her glasses were with Vivian. So was the explanation she'd been pretending she didn't need. Elena exhaled shakily and turned back, feet carrying her in the opposite direction despite every instinct screaming at her not to. This is just practical, she told herself as the library doors came into view. I'm not doing this for her. But her heart was already racing. And deep down, Elena knew she wasn't just going to get her glasses back. She was walking straight into whatever Vivian Cross had decided to start. The library lights hummed softly overhead. Elena hesitated just inside the entrance, heart pounding, breath shallow. Then she saw her. Vivian sat at their usual table, alone. Elena's glasses rested in front of her, spinning lazily under one finger. Her gaze wasn't smug this time, just distant, unfocused, like she'd been waiting longer than she meant to. For a second, Elena simply watched. Then she squared her shoulders and walked over. Why are you doing this? Vivian looked up, startled enough that the glasses stopped spinning. Her fingers closed around them instinctively. You came, she said instead. That's not an answer. Elena stopped across from her, hands clenched at her sides. You don't get to steal my things and decide when I show up. So why? Vivian leaned back in her chair, masking the flicker of something real behind her eyes. Relax. I borrowed them. You took them. Elena snapped. And you know exactly what you're doing. Vivian studied her, really studied her now. The tension in her posture, the way her jaw was set too tight. You want the truth? Vivian asked quietly. Yes. Vivian exhaled, rubbing the back of her neck. Because you keep avoiding me. That's not a reason. It is when you won't even look at me anymore. Elena's breath caught. You bullied me for months. You don't get to be upset that I don't want you near me. I know. Vivian said quickly, too quickly, and I'm not pretending I didn't. The admission hung between them. Then why now? Elena demanded. Why me? Vivian glanced down at the glasses in her hand, turning them over once. Because you stopped reacting, and I didn't like that. Elena frowned. That's it. No. Vivian leaned forward, elbows on the table, voice dropping. Because you challenge me. Because you don't look at me like everyone else does. Because when you ignore me, it feels like I'm losing something I didn't know I wanted. Elena stared at her, pulse roaring in her ears. This isn't a game, Elena said softly. You don't get to pull me in just because you're bored. Vivian swallowed. I'm not bored. Silence stretched. Vivian slid the glasses across the table, slowly, deliberately, stopping short of Elena's reach. I don't know what this is, Vivian said, but I'm not trying to hurt you. Elena didn't move to take them. Then stop, or tell me the truth. Vivian met her gaze. Expression stripped bare, for once. I don't want you to disappear on me, she said. The honesty unsettled her more than any taunt ever had. Silence settled between them. The library felt smaller now, the air too still. Elena stared at Vivian, like she was trying to solve a problem that refused to behave logically. You don't get to say things like that, Elena said finally. Her voice wasn't sharp, just strained. Not after everything. I know, Vivian replied. She didn't look away. That's why I'm saying it now. Elena exhaled slowly, grounding herself. Then stop making this harder. I don't know how, Vivian said, honest in a way that scared them both. You walk past me like I don't exist, and I let you, and then, she gestured vaguely, frustrated, I miss you. The word hung there. Elena's throat tightened. You don't miss me. You miss the fight. Vivian shook her head. No, I miss this. She tapped the edge of the table between them. You pushing back. You looking at me like you see through me. Elena's gaze dropped to Vivian's mouth before she could stop herself. She caught it. Of course she did. Vivian's voice softened. If you tell me to stop, I will. Elena should have said it. She should have reached across the table, taken her glasses, and walked away. Instead, Vivian stepped closer. Elena's back met the edge of a bookshelf before she fully realized she'd been guided there. The narrow aisle suddenly too tight to breathe in. Their cheeks brushed, barely, but it sent a shiver straight down Elena's spine. Vivian leaned in, voice low, careful, nothing like her usual taunts. Tell me I wasn't the only one who felt it, she murmured. That kiss didn't feel like nothing. Elena didn't answer. She couldn't. Admitting it out loud felt like crossing a line she'd never be able to redraw. But her body betrayed her anyway, her hand tightening in Vivian's shirt, fingers curling into the fabric like it was the only thing keeping her steady. Vivian inhaled sharply at the contact. This doesn't happen, Vivian said quietly. If all you feel for me is hate. Elena's grip tightened, and that was answer enough. Their breaths mingled. No rush, no heat, just awareness, humming and unbearable. This isn't a good idea, Elena murmured. I know, Vivian said. Neither of them moved. Vivian lifted a hand slowly, not touching, just hovering, giving Elena every chance to pull away. Elena didn't, so Vivian leaned in. The kiss was tentative, almost careful, a question, not a demand. Elena froze for half a heartbeat. Then she kissed her back. Soft, uncertain, real. When they pulled apart, it was barely an inch. Both of them breathing harder than they should have been. This doesn't leave this room, Elena said quietly. Vivian nodded. Of course. Elena reached for her glasses at last, slipping them on with trembling fingers. Neither of them smiled. Neither of them said goodbye. And when Elena walked away this time, she knew whatever this was, it had already crossed a line neither rivalry nor reason could pull back from. The walk back to her dorm felt longer than it should have. Elena kept her pace steady, even when her thoughts refused to do the same. The kiss replayed in fragments, not the moment their lips met, but the hesitation before it. The way Vivian had waited, the way Elena hadn't pulled away. That was the part she couldn't rationalize. Anger she understood. Adrenaline too. But this had been slow, deliberate, chosen. She pressed her thumb against the edge of her notebook until it hurt, grounding herself in something solid. It doesn't mean anything, she told herself. It can't. But that night, when she lay awake staring at the ceiling, she kept thinking about how close Vivian's voice had been, how soft, and how easily she'd let her stay there. The memory lingered, warm breath against her ear, the low edge of Vivian's voice stripped of its usual teasing sharpness. Not mocking, not challenging, just close. Elena turned onto her side, pressing her face into the pillow as if she could smother the thought before it settled deeper. Her phone rang. The sound cut clean through the quiet. She froze. The name glowing on the screen made her stomach tighten instantly. "Mother!" Elena sat up at once, posture straightening before she even answered, as though the woman on the other end could see her. "Hello, Mother." Her mother's voice came through crisp and composed, every syllable measured. Even over the phone, she carried the same controlled authority she did in person, the tone of someone accustomed to being listened to. Successful, exact, a woman whose life ran on schedules, expectations, and results earned through relentless work. "Elena, I hope I didn't interrupt your studying." "No," Elena said quickly. "I just finished reviewing today's material." "Good." A brief pause followed, not empty, but evaluative, as if her mother were already assessing her through silence alone. "How are your grades progressing?" "They're strong," Elena replied. "I'm maintaining top marks." "You understand consistency matters more than early performance," her mother said calmly. "If they begin to slip, we will need to reassess." Elena's grip tightened slightly around the phone. "Yes, Mother." "And football, you were made captain this year, correct?" Elena hesitated, just a fraction too long. Images flashed uninvited. The tunnel, the kiss, the shouting coaches, the disappointment in her manager's voice. She swallowed. "Everything is going well," she said evenly. "The team is performing strongly. I'm managing my responsibilities." "Good." Satisfaction threaded through the word. "Leadership suits you when you apply yourself properly." Elena nodded automatically, even though she couldn't be seen. "Yes." "I hear the finals are coming up soon." "That's correct." A brief pause, measured and deliberate. "Then make sure it doesn't interfere with your academics. I know football matters to you, but your education determines your future. If your grades begin to suffer, you will step back from it. Is that understood?" Elena felt her shoulders tense. "Yes, Mother." "Good. I'll be checking in on your progress." "I expect everything to be in order." "I understand. I'll make sure it is." "Excellent. Keep focused, Elena." The call ended shortly after, efficient, purposeful, without lingering sentiment. Elena lowered the phone slowly. The room felt quieter afterward, heavier. She exhaled, the breath leaving her in a long, controlled sigh as tension finally slipped from her shoulders. Her hands fell into her lap, fingers curling loosely as the weight of the conversation settled back over her. The agreement moving here for university had never been unconditional. Her mother had agreed, only because Elena had proven she could excel, top of her class, exceptional in every extracurricular, disciplined enough to justify independence. She had to be the best. Anything less meant reassessment, correction, going home, private education, structure chosen for her instead of by her. Everything she had here, the campus, the team, the life she was building, depended on maintaining perfection. And Vivian Cross threatened all of it, reckless, careless, unpredictable, a distraction that turned discipline into impulse, focus into heat, decisions into mistakes she couldn't afford. Elena closed her eyes. The kiss had been a moment, a lapse, a fleeting spark born from adrenaline and proximity. Nothing more. It had to be nothing more. She couldn't risk losing everything for something so unstable. Slowly, she pulled the blanket higher and stared back at the ceiling, resolve settling into place where uncertainty had been. She needed distance. She needed control. She needed to remember her priorities. And Vivian Cross could not be one of them. The next day was worse. They didn't speak in class. They didn't even look at each other. Elena took notes furiously, pen scratching too hard against the page. Every time Vivian shifted in her seat, Elena felt it anyway, like awareness had replaced sight. Across the aisle, Vivian sat perfectly still. She hadn't slept either. The quiet kiss haunted her in a way the angry one never had. There was no excuse to hide behind this time, no heat of the moment justification. Just the memory of Elena choosing her back. Vivian had never been good with things she couldn't joke away. So she didn't. She didn't tease, didn't smirk, didn't provoke. She watched Elena leave class without a word and felt something uncomfortably close to loss settle in her chest. On the field, everything fractured. They played like strangers who knew each other too well. Passes were sharper, tackles cleaner, but something essential was missing. No taunts, no lingering looks. When they collided, they separated instantly, like contact itself was a mistake. Both teams noticed. By halftime, frustration bled into the game. Elena missed a pass she never should have. Vivian hesitated just once, and it cost her. They locked eyes across the field, breathless, unsettled. This wasn't rivalry. This was avoidance dressed up as discipline. After practice, Vivian found herself in the empty locker room, hands braced against the bench, staring at nothing. Say something, she told herself. But what? Sorry felt insufficient. Pretending felt impossible. And wanting felt dangerous. Across campus, Elena sat at her desk, project notes untouched. She'd built her life on control, on rules and structure, and knowing where she stood. Now, there was a variable she couldn't solve for. She hated that it mattered. She hated more that it already did. They passed each other that evening near the quad. No one else around. No noise to hide behind. Vivian stopped. Elena! Elena paused. Didn't turn around. Yes. Vivian swallowed. We can't keep pretending that didn't happen. Silence stretched between them. Then Elena turned slowly, carefully. Her expression was guarded, but her eyes were honest in a way that made Vivian's chest tighten. I know, Elena said, and Elena exhaled, and I don't know what to do with that. For the first time, Vivian didn't have a comeback. She nodded once. Me neither. They stood there, caught between what they'd been and what they were becoming, neither willing to step away, neither brave enough to step forward yet. But the line had already been crossed, and this time there was no pretending it hadn't been. They didn't talk about the kiss right away. That was the rule they fell into without saying it out loud. It happened after practice, late enough that the locker rooms were nearly empty, the air still smelling faintly of grass and sweat. Elena lingered by the exit, bag slung over her shoulder, clearly debating whether to leave without acknowledging what now sat between them. Vivian noticed. You're doing it again, she said. Elena turned slowly. Doing what? Running? I'm setting boundaries. Vivian huffed a quiet laugh. Funny, because it feels like avoidance. Elena crossed her arms, grounding herself. Whatever this is, it can't interfere. Not with class, not with football, and definitely not with our teams. Vivian studied her face, serious, controlled, terrified. Okay, Vivian said, then let's make it simple. Elena frowned. Simple how? Vivian stepped closer, but stopped herself short this time. Deliberate restraint. We don't talk about it. We don't do this. She gestured vaguely between them. In public. And the second either of us says stop, it stops. Elena hesitated. That's it. Vivian tilted her head. Temporary. No expectations. No promises. Elena should have said no. Instead she said, This is a bad idea. Vivian smiled, faintly. You're still here. Silence stretched. Then Elena nodded once. Temporary. Temporary, Vivian echoed. They shook on it, brief, almost formal. Neither of them mentioned the way Vivian's thumb lingered a fraction too long against Elena's wrist. The arrangement didn't make things easier. If anything, it made everything sharper. They didn't sit together in class, but Vivian passed Elena notes anyway. Not jokes, not insults, but questions. Real ones. Elena answered them in the margins, pretending her heart didn't race every time she recognized Vivian's handwriting. On the field, they played like nothing had changed. Off it, they met in quiet corners and empty rooms, pretending the rules made it safe. It was always Vivian who broke first, stepping too close, brushing fingers, murmuring something low enough that it felt like a secret meant only for Elena. And it was always Elena who let her. This doesn't mean anything. Elena reminded her one night, voice barely above a whisper. Vivian leaned against the wall beside her, close but not touching. Of course not. They kissed anyway. Soft. Familiar now. Dangerous. Every time Elena told herself this was controlled, contained. Every time Vivian left wondering how long Temporary could survive the way Elena looked at her when she thought no one was watching. Neither of them said it out loud, but somewhere between the rules and the quiet, both of them knew Temporary was already slipping through their fingers. The first rule to break was distance. It happened in the library. Of course it did. Late evening, most students gone. The quiet thick enough to feel like pressure. They were supposed to be working, laptops open, notes spread between them. They weren't touching. That was the lie. Vivian leaned over Elena's shoulder to read something on her screen, close enough that Elena could feel her warmth, could smell her shampoo. Elena didn't move away, didn't tell her to step back. You're distracted, Vivian murmured. I'm working. Elena replied too quickly. Vivian smiled. Sure you are. Elena closed the laptop with a sharp click. This wasn't supposed to be like this. Vivian tilted her head. Like what? Like I'm thinking about you, and I shouldn't be. Elena said, like I'm waiting for you to show up. The words slipped out before she could stop them. Vivian froze. That doesn't sound temporary, she said softly. Elena stood abruptly. We said no expectations. And I agreed. Vivian replied, I didn't say I was good at lying to myself. That night, they kissed longer than usual. No one said stop. The second rule to break was secrecy. People started noticing. Vivian stopped flirting with anyone else. Elena stopped sitting with Maya. Their attention bent toward each other in small, unconscious ways. Glances held too long, bodies angling closer without realizing it. At practice, a teammate nudged Vivian. You okay? You've been staring at Northside's captain like she stole your lunch. Vivian snapped back to focus. Elena's team noticed too. You're playing different, her vice captain said. More reckless. Elena shook her head. I'm fine. She wasn't. The third rule shattered completely after a match neither of them could afford to lose. They were tied in the final minutes. Tempers flared. The crowd was loud enough to drown thought. Vivian tackled Elena hard. Too hard. Elena shoved her back. The referee blew the whistle as they stood chest to chest, fury flashing, something deeper burning underneath it. You're off your game, Vivian muttered. So, are you? Elena snapped. This is why this was a mistake. The words cut deeper than either of them expected. After the match, Vivian didn't wait. She found Elena in the tunnel, grabbed her wrist, and pulled her into an empty equipment room, door slamming shut behind them. "You don't get to call me a mistake," Vivian said, breathing hard. Elena yanked her hand free. "Then stop acting like I am." Silence. Then Vivian said, low and dangerous, "Say it again. Tell me you don't want this." Elena opened her mouth. Nothing came out. Vivian laughed once, sharp and breathless. "That's what I thought." They kissed like they were running out of time. When they broke apart, Elena's voice shook. This was supposed to be temporary. Vivian rested her forehead against Elena's. Yeah. They didn't pull away. Later that night, alone in their separate rooms, the truth finally caught up with both of them. Elena stared at the ceiling, heart aching in a way no plan could fix. Vivian sat on her bed, phone in hand, thumb hovering over Elena's name. Temporary had rules. Whatever this was didn't, and neither of them knew how to stop it anymore. Elena hadn't meant for it to spiral like this. Lately, her thoughts kept circling the same questions, no matter how hard she tried to outrun them. Was Vivian serious? Or was this just another game she was destined to lose? Was any of it real? Or just something temporary Vivian would eventually shrug off when it became inconvenient? And worst of all, was Vivian worth risking everything Elena had worked for? Her grades, her team, her carefully controlled life? Elena stared at the open textbook in front of her without seeing a single word. "Hey!" She blinked as someone slid into the chair beside her. Maya set her bag down, gently, eyes warm with concern rather than curiosity. She'd been in Elena's program for months now, quiet, thoughtful, observant in a way that made Elena feel seen without feeling exposed. "You okay?" Maya asked softly. "You seem like your head's been somewhere else these days." Elena hesitated, then shook her head. "I'm fine, just tired." Maya smiled, not pushing. "Fair. Midterms are brutal." She glanced at Elena's notes. "You always look like you're carrying the weight of the room, you know." Elena huffed a small, surprised laugh. "That obvious? Only if someone's paying attention," Maya said easily, and she was. That was the problem. Maya asked questions that made Elena slow down and think. She listened, really listened, without interrupting, without challenging for the sake of it. She didn't tease or provoke or destabilize Elena's routines. She fit neatly into the life Elena had built. "You don't talk about yourself much," Maya said one afternoon, tone gentle, "but you're intense. In a good way. Focused. It's kind of impressive." Elena felt warmth creep into her cheeks before she could stop it. Across the room, Vivian watched. She told herself it was nothing. She told herself Elena deserved someone calm, someone steady, someone who didn't complicate everything just by walking into the room. She told herself she didn't care. She lied. Vivian told herself she was imagining it, the way Elena's shoulders eased when Maya sat beside her, the way she leaned in, not much, barely noticeable, but enough that it set something sharp off in Vivian's chest. It didn't mean anything. Elena leaned toward people when she listened. That was just how she was. Vivian watched anyway. From across the room, she tracked every small thing she shouldn't have been paying attention to. The faint smile Elena didn't bother hiding. The way Maya angled her chair closer. The way Elena didn't move it away. Something hot and ugly twisted low in Vivian's stomach. "You don't get to feel this," she told herself. "You agreed this was temporary." Maya laughed softly at something Elena said. Vivian didn't hear the joke. She didn't need to. She knew that laugh, knew what it meant to earn it. Her jaw tightened. Of course Elena would gravitate towards someone like Maya. Someone calm, someone safe, someone who didn't shove her into walls or steal her glasses or pretend feelings were a game with rules you could rewrite. Someone who wouldn't hesitate. Vivian's fingers curled into her palm. Good, she thought bitterly. That's what you wanted. An exit. So, why did it feel like she was being replaced? She caught herself leaning forward, elbows on her knees, eyes fixed on the two of them, like if she stared hard enough, something would change. It didn't. Maya said something else. Elena flushed just a little. That did it. Vivian stood abruptly, chair scraping loud enough to earn a few glances. She didn't care. She grabbed her bag and left the room before the tightness in her chest turned into something worse. Outside, the air was cold, sharp grounding. It didn't help. She deserves better, Vivian told herself as she paced the quad. Someone who doesn't drag her into this mess. But the thought didn't bring relief. It brought panic, because better didn't hurt like this. Because if Elena chose Maya, really chose her, Vivian wouldn't even get to be angry. She wouldn't get to fight. She'd just lose. The idea hollowed her out. Later, alone in her room, Vivian tried to distract herself. Music playing too loud. Homework open but untouched. Her phone flipped face down beside her like it couldn't tempt her if she refused to look at it. It didn't work. The feeling sat heavy in her chest, unwelcome and persistent, tightening every time her thoughts drifted back to Elena leaning toward Maya, listening in that quiet way she rarely offered anyone else. Before she could talk herself out of it, Vivian grabbed her phone and typed, "You busy?" The message sent before she could reconsider. 3 dots appeared almost immediately. Studying. Staying behind with Maya. Vivian stared at the screen. Something sharp twisted in her stomach. Her thumbs moved faster than her better judgment. Oh, so that's how it is. She regretted it the second it sent, but not enough to delete it. No reply came right away. Silence stretched, feeding every worst assumption her mind could invent. Of course Elena chose Maya. The jealousy hit hard and fast, spiraling into something ugly she barely recognized in herself. She tossed her phone onto the bed, pacing instead, jaw tight. You don't get to care this much, she told herself. But the feeling refused to listen. By the time night fell, the spiral had sharpened into resolve. If Elena was moving on, then so would she. If this was temporary, then she'd prove it. Vivian grabbed her jacket and headed for the party she'd sworn she didn't care about. She told herself she just wanted distraction. She told herself she was done waiting. She told herself this would make it stop hurting. She lied again. The party was already loud when Vivian arrived. Music spilled out through the open front door, bass thumping softly beneath layers of conversation and laughter. The house buzzed with movement. People crowded into the living room, voices overlapping, the air warm with the smell of cheap drinks, and too many bodies packed into one space. She didn't hesitate at the door, didn't give herself time to. She stepped inside like she belonged there, like this was still her territory, like nothing had shifted under her feet in the last few weeks. Someone shouted her name from across the room. Hands clapped her on the shoulder. A drink appeared in her hand before she even registered asking for one. Muscle memory took over. She lifted the cup, smiled easily, played the role everyone knew, the confident captain, the girl who never stayed serious for long. The smile settled onto her face, but it felt wrong, too sharp, too hollow, like it belonged to someone she'd already outgrown. She drank anyway. Across campus, the study room was almost silent, the kind of silence that pressed in rather than comforted. Elena sat surrounded by neatly stacked notes and open textbooks, her pen hovering uselessly above the page. Maya sat across from her, patient and focused, gently nudging papers into better order. They'd been at this for over an hour. Elena kept glancing at the clock, not because she needed to leave, but because she didn't know whether she wanted to. Irritation and guilt tangled tight in her chest. Emotions she refused to examine too closely. "You're allowed to be here," she told herself firmly. "You're allowed to choose something easy, something safe." Maya noticed the distraction almost immediately. "Hey," she said softly, breaking the quiet. "If you want to head out, we can pick this up tomorrow. You look like your thoughts are somewhere else." Elena shook her head too quickly, the movement betraying her. "No, sorry. I'm fine. Just tired." Maya's smile was gentle, unbothered. "You don't have to apologize for that." The kindness in her voice, unconditional, uncomplicated, made Elena's chest ache in a way she hadn't expected. Vivian downed her drink too fast. The burn barely registered. Someone brushed past her shoulder, laughing, leaning close to say something she didn't catch over the music. Normally she would have leaned right back in, let the familiarity take over, flirted without thought or consequence. Tonight, her mind betrayed her. She thought of Elena instead, of the way Elena leaned toward Maya, just slightly, of how she hadn't pulled away. A sharp, unwelcome jealousy flared hot in Vivian's chest. Temporary, she reminded herself harshly. "You agreed this was temporary. Dance with me." The girl beside her asked, pretty familiar, easy in the way that used to be enough. Vivian hesitated for half a heartbeat. Then she nodded. Sure. Because stopping, really stopping, felt worse. The girl's hands slid around her waist, warm and confident. Vivian let them stay, let herself be pulled closer, letting the press of bodies and noise swallow thought. She tilted her head, let the moment happen. This is fine, she told herself desperately. This is what moving on looks like. But just before their lips could meet, something in her chest recoiled. Vivian pulled back abruptly, breath catching as clarity cut through the haze of music and distraction. The realization landed all at once, sharp and undeniable. If she crossed that line, there would be no undoing it. No pretending it hadn't meant something. No going back to whatever fragile, unfinished things still existed between her and Elena. It felt like betrayal. And the worst part was knowing she'd come here, fully prepared to do it anyway. She stepped away, running a hand through her hair, heart pounding too hard for someone who had supposedly decided to move on. Someone nearby lifted a phone, the screen glowing bright as they recorded a clip, laughing, shouting, documenting the night. Vivian didn't notice. She was too busy pretending the tightness in her chest was excitement and not loss. Too busy convincing herself she'd stopped in time. Too late. Elena packed her bag. When they finally finished studying, she moved slowly, deliberately, as if stretching the moment without understanding why. Maya mirrored her pace, slipping her own books away with quiet care. They left the building together, cool night air meeting them as they stepped onto the quad. Campus lights glowed softly against the dark, paths nearly empty this late, the distant hum of conversation drifting from dorm windows. Their footsteps fell into an easy rhythm as they walked toward the residence halls. You know, Maya said after a while, voice careful and sincere, if you ever want to talk about what's going on in your head, I'm a good listener. Elena froze mid-step. The offer wasn't loaded. It wasn't flirtatious. It didn't demand anything. That made it harder. Elena started, then stopped herself. She forced a small, controlled smile. Thanks. I'll keep that in mind. Maya nodded, accepting the boundary without resentment. They reached the split in the path near the dorm entrances. Good night, Elena. Good night. Maya turned and headed toward her building, unhurried, leaving Elena standing beneath the soft glow of a lamppost for a moment longer than necessary. Across campus, Vivian stumbled along the sidewalk, jacket slung over one shoulder, the night air doing little to clear her head. She felt like an idiot. The party still rang in her ears. The noise, the laughter, the version of herself she tried to step back into and failed to recognize. Every decision replayed on a cruel loop. What were you thinking? She dragged a hand over her face, exhaling sharply, then stopped. Ahead of her, across the quad, she spotted two familiar figures beneath the lamplight. Elena and Maya. They stood close, talking quietly. The scene was painfully calm, easy, comfortable in a way Vivian suddenly realized she had never managed to be. Her chest tightened. They said their goodbyes. Maya turned away with a soft smile, while Elena lingered. A sharp thought cut through the fog in Vivian's mind. If you don't do something now, you're going to lose her. Panic surged, sudden and overwhelming. She stepped forward. Elena got the message by accident. She wasn't looking for it. She was half distracted, thumbs scrolling through notifications, barely registering as she started toward the dorm entrance. Then a story loaded on her screen. A shared post, bright lights, music she could almost hear through the image. And there, unmistakable even through motion blur, was Vivian, too close to someone else. A stranger's hand at her waist. Vivian's mouth angled toward their ear. Her smile sharp and careless in the way it only ever was when she wanted to look untouchable. Elena stopped walking. The world tilted slightly, sound draining away until only a dull hum filled her ears. So that's what this was, she thought distantly. A joke, a phase, something she could shrug off in a night. Her chest tightened, not with anger, but something colder, something final. Her fingers trembled as she locked her phone, pressing the screen dark like it could erase what she'd seen. She didn't cry. That almost made it worse. Vance. Vivian's voice cut across the quad. Elena's shoulders stiffened. She didn't turn. She kept walking. Elena, wait. The sound of hurried footsteps followed as Vivian closed the distance, determination overriding hesitation. Elena reached the dorm entrance, pushing the door open. Vivian caught it before it could swing shut. Can you just stop for a second? Elena turned then, expression controlled, but distant in a way Vivian had never seen before. What? She asked quietly. The single word knocked every prepared thought out of Vivian's head. The confession came out wrong immediately, messy, unfiltered. Vivian opened her mouth, closed it again, then let out a quiet breath like she was bracing herself. I don't know how to say this without ruining it, she admitted, so I'm just going to say it. Elena didn't move. Vivian swallowed, hands restless at her sides. Every ounce of her usual confidence stripped away. Please don't choose her, she said softly. I can't keep pretending this is temporary. I really tried to treat it like it didn't matter, like it was just fun or competition or whatever excuse made it easier. Her eyes lifted, meeting Elena's fully. No teasing, no arrogance, no mask, just honesty. I'm in love with you, Vivian said. Not loud, not careful, just real. And I don't know how to be good at that yet. The words hung between them, fragile and irreversible. Vivian exhaled shakily, but didn't look away. I know I've been awful to you. At the start. Hell, even after. We fought. And I pushed. And half the time I didn't even understand why I cared so much. I just knew that when you looked at me like I didn't impress you, it mattered more than anything else. Her voice softened, almost uncertain. You're steady. You know who you are. You work harder than anyone I've ever met, and you never pretend to be something you're not. You make everything around you feel real. Safe. She hesitated, the admission clearly costing her. I think I spent so long trying to get a reaction out of you because you were the first person who ever made me want to be better instead of just admired. A small breath left her. I know you deserve better than how I've treated you. Probably better than me, if I'm being honest. But I don't want to mess this up anymore. I don't want to hurt you again. She shook her head slightly, searching for words she wasn't used to saying. I want a chance to do this right. With you. Silence followed. Elena stared at her, expression unreadable. For a moment, Vivian almost believed she'd said the right thing. Then, Elena slowly lifted her phone. The screen glowed between them. A pause story post. Bright lights. A crowded party. A stranger's hand wrapped around Vivian's waist. Vivian leaning close, smiling like nothing in the world could touch her. Elena's voice was quiet when she spoke. Does this look like love to you? Vivian's gut dropped. The weight of it hit all at once. How it looked, how it must have felt, how badly she'd misjudged everything. And for the first time since Elena Vance had known her, Vivian Cross looked completely, devastatingly unsure of herself. The silence between them stretched like a wound. Vivian stared at the frozen image on Elena's phone. Her own face, her own smile, her own hands resting on a stranger's waist like it meant nothing. Because at the time, she'd wanted it to mean nothing. She'd wanted to prove she could walk away. Stupid. So stupid. That's not. Vivian started, then stopped. Swallowed. Tried again. That's not what it looks like. Elena's expression didn't change. Then what is it? Vivian opened her mouth. Closed it. The truth sat heavy in her chest, too big and too raw to shape into words. I went there to forget you, she admitted finally. I was jealous. I saw you with Maya, and she ran a hand through her hair, frustrated. I thought if I could just be the person I used to be, it wouldn't hurt so much. But I couldn't. I can't. She gestured at the phone. That girl? She didn't mean anything. I pulled away before anything happened. I swear. Elena's jaw tightened. You didn't pull away fast enough. The words landed like a slap. Vivian felt her carefully constructed composure crack further. You're right. I should have never been there at all. But I wasn't thinking. I was just trying to make the feeling stop. What feeling? Vivian's throat tightened. The feeling of watching you with someone else and realizing I had no right to be jealous because I was the one who said temporary. The feeling of knowing I'd ruin everything if I told you the truth. She stepped closer, close enough to see the faint tremor in Elena's hands. I'm not asking you to forgive me, Vivian said quietly. I'm asking you to let me explain. To let me show you that this, she gestured between them, isn't a game. It never was. I was just too scared to admit it. Elena's grip on her phone loosened slightly. Her scent, that clean, rain-on-concrete scent, had shifted, sharp with hurt, and something underneath, something that smelled like hope. Even now. You don't get to do this, Elena said, voice cracking at the edges. You don't get to push me away and pull me back and expect me to just I know. Vivian's voice broke. I know I don't. I know I've given you every reason to walk away. But I'm asking you not to. Not yet. Just, she pressed a hand to her chest like she could physically hold herself together. Give me one chance to prove I can be the person you deserve. That's all I need. One chance. Elena stared at her for a long moment. The hum of the dorm's fluorescent lights filled the silence. Somewhere down the hall, a door clicked shut. Then Elena's shoulders sagged, just slightly, just enough. You're impossible, she murmured. Vivian's breath caught. I know. Elena shook her head, but something in her expression had softened. You don't even know how to do this right, do you? No, Vivian admitted. I don't, but I want to learn. The words hung there, vulnerable and raw. Elena studied her, really studied her. The way Vivian's hands were shaking, the way her usual defenses had crumbled completely, the way she looked like she was bracing for the worst. Then Elena reached out, slowly, carefully, and took Vivian's hand. It wasn't forgiveness. Not yet, but it was something. Vivian exhaled a breath she hadn't realized she'd been holding. This doesn't mean I trust you yet, Elena said quietly. It means I'm willing to listen. That's more than I deserve. Don't argue. Vivian's lips twitched into something that was almost a smile. Wouldn't dream of it. They stood there in the dim light of the dormitory entrance, hands intertwined, the weight of the night slowly settling around them. It wasn't resolution. It wasn't a happily ever after. But it was a start. And for now, that was enough. The weeks that followed were uncertain. Not bad, just uncertain. Elena didn't jump back into whatever they'd had before. She kept her distance in class, continued studying with Maya, maintained the careful structure of her life. But she also let Vivian sit beside her in the library, let Vivian walk her to her dorm after late practices, let Vivian hold her hand under the table when no one was watching. Slowly, painfully, they rebuilt something new. Vivian was different now. Not the confident, untouchable captain who'd made Elena's life hell, but someone raw and real and trying. She still teased, still pushed boundaries, but there was a gentleness underneath that hadn't been there before. She started showing up early to class, taking notes, paying attention. When Elena asked why, Vivian just shrugged. You make me want to be better, she said simply. So I'm trying. It wasn't easy. There were setbacks, Vivian's instinct to deflect with humor, Elena's instinct to retreat into silence. They argued. They made up. They argued again. But through it all, they kept choosing each other. The night before finals, Elena found Vivian sitting alone on the bleachers, staring up at the stadium lights. Couldn't sleep. Elena asked, sitting down beside her. Vivian shook her head. Too much in my head. About finals? About you. Vivian glanced at her, a faint smile on her lips. About us. Elena's heart tightened. What about us? Vivian was quiet for a moment. Then she turned, taking Elena's hand in hers. I don't know what the future looks like, she admitted. And I know I don't deserve you, but I want to keep trying. For as long as you'll let me. Elena looked down at their intertwined fingers, then up at Vivian's face, open, honest, scared. And she smiled. That sounds like a pretty good start. Vivian's face lit up in a way Elena had never seen before. Not the sharp, careless smirk she wore like armor, but something real, something vulnerable. Really? She asked quietly. Really? They sat there in the quiet of the stadium, hands clasped, the weight of everything they'd been through settling into something softer. It wasn't perfect. It wasn't easy, but it was theirs.